One of my favorite topics about music is how it relates to language. And I have thought about this a lot. I mean, my background, I started studying music as an adult in college. I was 20, and I just took a group piano class, and the guy was a genius. He ended up creating our whole curriculum many years later, Don Beatty from Southern Illinois University. And I got very fascinated with this, but he approached music in a very unorthodox, kind of no sacred cows way, and very refreshing, but also very unique. And he taught the elements of music rather than music notation and theory, and got us playing and doing things amazing very quickly. Truly an amazing man, and I've tried to follow and emulate his philosophy and theories about music in our game, and it kind of reflected other aspects of music. We had more solutions with notation, learning notation that way rather than the improvisation that he really specialized in. The point is, I was also a linguistics major at the time, and I saw the parallels in many ways as I was trying to learn music as an adult and finding it really dense. I took multiple music classes. His was a group piano class that was very fruitful, and I also took ear training, and I took harmony, not knowing that harmony had a year prerequisite of another, the basics of music class that I just skipped to them, just taking as a elective. But harmony was dense, and ear training was brutal. I did, it was like, two different, what's the variation between, this color brown and that color brown? What's the interval between that? That's how, musical intervals for ear training was very tough for me. That being said, I was also studying French. I ended up studying Chinese and Japanese. I got really excited about other languages, and I was a linguistics major. So we look at the structure of all languages. So phonetics is one aspect, syntax is another aspect. But one of the more fascinating things for me was historical linguistics, how language families kind of migrate. Indo-European is our base language that moved into the Romans, the Latin, and into the French, and the French conquered the English, and lots of English words come from the French. Hundreds of years the French ruled. French was the legal language in England. People don't know that. So there's this tremendous, legacy of how language evolves over time. And I thought that was fascinating. And when I looked at music notation, the history of music notation, I mean, literally Guido with his, 4 fingers, like he had, the earliest music notation was his hand, right? He's drawing on his hand and pointing to his hand to different notes on a very simple scale, a pentatonic scale. And then, how that evolved into very complex musical notation, so there's the 5 fingers, eventually, and then, this one's singing down here in harmony, and 2 staffs, and it evolves over time, and then you look back and you go, oh, now I understand why it's so crazy, right? It just was like add-on. The same way that English is a crazy language, it's a salad language. So music notation is kind of like that. It's just this salad of different influences. You have Italian words in there, allegro, dolce, and then you have these completely Germanic, ideas in there of structure and organization, and you have French, influences from the Impressionist periods. It is all kind of layered in there, and it makes it very complex. So I looked at that historically, but the real key for me that got me very excited, and actually I ended up doing my master's thesis related to this, was what was called developmental linguistics. So developmental linguistics is how we learn our native language. How does a child, come out from nothing and then start to speak whatever language is around? Chinese, Hungarian, Finnish, and I'm naming some really Basque, some really complicated languages for Westerners, Arabic, English. How do they speak that fluently by the time they're 4 or 5, with, without fail almost, right? There's something organic in the brain about that. So if we could follow that natural language process And the way we learn a second language is often very abstract. We learn a bunch of vocabulary, we learn some formulas, we learn some grammar, and we try and construct this, yo soy muy feliz, right? Oh, soy muy, we need an adjective there, feliz, and then they're like, okay, no, feliz soy muy, we really struggle with this because it's very abstract to us. It's not the way we learned our first language. But when you go to another country and you're immersed in it and you're forced and people are correcting you all the time and you're struggling and you're hearing this, there's a native language acquisition process. And I thought some cultures seem to have that for music, right? Some cultures, it feels like they have a native language acquisition process with music. And I actually did my thesis that Brazil was one of those cultures, and I went there, and that led to a ton of great experiences and insights, which led actually almost directly to the game. So the thing I want to share with you, that like music, language is oral first, right? And then it's written, and then it's analyzed by structure. So our game actually takes that. Learn to play first, then learn to read music, right, that you already know how to play. Then learn about the theory. And that process has proven to be much more intuitive and much more effective than, the traditional start with the theory, decode that, then you can play, kind of decode some written, and then you play that. And that has not worked for most of us. And when you think of traditional piano lessons, and there are many non-traditional piano teachers like mine was, and that are wonderful. But language is also organized, right? There are certain ways it connects, right? And so music has similar connections. The origins of music and language are probably emphatic sounds, right? So, right? Oh, that feels good. Like somebody's giving you a back massage, a mother comforting a baby, right? These are very primary intonations, right? Surprise. I mean, there are certain inflections that are almost universal across all languages. So falling at the end of the pitch is very common, and actually the tone often will fall like a minor third. There's actually, tonal relationships in almost all languages with the way you end a sentence, like I just ended that sentence. Okay, so there's all these kinds of crossovers, and Leonard Bernstein, the great composer, wrote an interesting book on different kinds of things, and he talked about, there isn't really musical prose. There's poetry is like the closest thing in human language to music, because it has this structure, it has this repetition, it has these devices. But in fact, many of us have heard musical prose, stuff that wasn't really organized well, and wasn't really interesting, and wasn't structured in a way that kept our interest. Music has a lower threshold, I think, for that, because when it does get it right, when it is poetry, it is very powerful. And so the poor compositions don't even get qualified as music, is my opinion. The point is, there's a lot of crossovers, in particular in how we learn, right? And that's where I feel is a lot of fruit. If you look at the way we learn our first language, it's very passive first, okay? A 1-year-old can understand much more than they can say, right? Later on, they start to experiment. They say this, they say that. They get feedback, instant feedback, loving feedback, we hope. And so our game is very gentle. It's not harsh at all. There's no negative feedback in it. Then they experiment, they put things together, and they learn to speak. And only later do we teach them words written on paper that represent what they already know. They're already fluent in the language. They can already say, see Dick go, run Jane run. They know those words already. So learning those abstract symbols that represent those words is much easier than if you try to teach them another language, French, words they don't even know, and try to let them read that, right? That would be incredibly complex. But that's what we do with traditional piano lessons, in the past, where, okay, here's a C sharp and F sharp, and there's this key, and and the kids are looking up and going, "Take me now, Lord. I've suffered enough. I really don't get this," right? It's too abstract for them. So we take it very direct, and that is directly from the linguistics that I saw. We learn to speak first, then we learn to read, then we learn grammar. Once we're fluent in both reading and speaking, then we start to abstractly study the language and perfect the language and get more sophisticated with the language. So theory has an excellent place in your music education, but not as a prerequisite to learning just to play a song. Thank you.